This video tutorial is editing the appearance of your project items using Microsoft Expression Blend. We'll be further enhancing the look of our Silverlight video player with more fills, gradients, strokes, and beveled edges, and we'll also be covering how to scale some of its components. So assuming that you've got your project already open, make sure you go to the Window menu and then choose the Design Workspace. Also, press the F12 key to make sure that your results window is hidden. And also make sure you're zoomed in to 100%. Okay, so we're looking at our Silverlight video player, and it still needs a little bit of work as far as the artwork is concerned. So let's start by adding a little bit of splash of color to it. One of the nice things is that since we imported the basic framework of our video player from Adobe Illustrator, it came in as a vector-based image, and we can work with that vector-based image just as if we had created those objects straight from Microsoft Expression Blend. So over in the Objects and Timeline panel, let's expand our video window and then choose the video frame. As you can see, this frame already comes with a gradient fill. But we can change that fill to a solid fill by using the solid colored brush. Just make sure that you've got fill selected under brushes. Now suddenly our background has changed to black. That's because the default fill color is black. But we can use this little eyedropper tool and then hover that straight over our logo background. So now the background bleeds straight into the background of our logo and looks perfectly seamless. Just make sure you click on the actual color that you want to use. Now let's say that we wanted to change the color of both the logo background and the frame color. For example, let's go to a nice lighter blue color. And now this time let's change our logo background to blend straight into the frame color. So back in the Objects and Timeline panel, let's select our logo badge and expand that, and then select the nameplate. You can see if I hide and unhide the nameplate that represents the background of the logo. Back over in the Properties panel, I can see that I'm fading my nameplate from a light yellow color into a deep red color. It's that deep red color that I want to change, and I want to bleed directly into our blue background. So go ahead and select that gradient stop, and then again use the dropper, and then click on that background color. So now we have a nice seamless transition from our logo badge into our background, this time with a new color. But let's bring up the brightness of our background of the logo, where the yellow area is, a little bit further. So again, let's go back and select our first gradient stop, and we'll move that gradient stop a little bit to the right to make that gradient color a little bit more prominent. As we covered in a previous snippet, there is another way to manipulate the gradient, and that's through the Gradient tool. Let's zoom in a little bit so you can see better. Now I've made sure I've reselected my nameplate object in the Objects and Timeline panel, and now we can see the Gradient tool showing up nice and clearly. Well, I can drag that arrow tip to make my gradient effect a little bit larger. If you go too large, you'll notice that the canvas will scroll out of position. So we can manually drag that back. So in this case, we need a little bit more room to work with, so we can zoom out just a little bit more. So we still have a gradient effect in our logo badge, but we have expanded it closer to the edges of our badge. Again, by dragging the arrow tip inward and outward, you can expand and contract that gradient effect. And many of the things that we can do with the gradient stops in the Properties panel, we can do straight through this Gradient tool. For example, I can double click on this gradient position where you see this circle, and I can change the color from here. I can also move the gradient position straight from here, and it correspondingly moves the gradient stop in the Properties panel. The same thing holds true for the second gradient stop. I can also add new gradient stops by clicking somewhere else on the gradient tool. You'll notice a plus sign next to the arrow. That means you can add a new gradient stop. We can change the color of that gradient stop, and we can remove that gradient stop by clicking on it and by dragging away from the gradient tool. So let's zoom out again and recenter our canvas by pressing Ctrl 0. So that looks pretty good. We can now hide the gradient tool by clicking on the selection tool. Now let's concentrate on changing the stroke of this video player. Again, this stroke came in from an Adobe Illustrator file and came in as a vector-based image, so we can change it just like any other stroke. So heading back into the Objects and Timeline panel, make sure you've got the video window expanded and select Frame Stroke. Now over in the Properties panel, you'll want to make sure you select the Stroke option under Brushes. Now to make the stroke a little bit more visible, let's increase the stroke thickness from 3 up to 6. Now because the object handles are visible at this point, it's slightly obstructing our stroke. So one way around that is to click somewhere off of your canvas, and then you can see it. Another way to do it is to go back and select the frame stroke in the Objects and Timeline panel, and then go into the View menu, and then uncheck Show Handles. You'll notice that there's an F9 key option, but that doesn't always work depending on where your focus is. So when it doesn't work, the best thing to do is to go open the View menu and check it from there. So now we can see our stroke and it's not obstructed. So we can go back into our Properties panel and change the color of this stroke. But what we really want to do is to give a little bit of a beveled look, which means that we want to have a lighting effect on the stroke. So let's go ahead and change the stroke to a gradient stroke. Now the trick here is to start out with the same color as the actual video player. So first select the lower gradient stop, and then use the eyedropper tool, and then go ahead and select that blue color. And then we can do the same thing for the other gradient stop, and then use the eyedropper tool and select the same gradient color. So initially our image looks much flatter than we want it to be. But now we can adjust the darkness and lightness of these gradient stops to give a more three-dimensional effect. So again, let's go ahead and select the first gradient stop, and then in the color palette, let's make that brighter, and maybe even a touch whiter. And then with the second gradient stop, let's select that and make that a little bit darker. And we can do that simply by dragging that downward. So we're trying to basically stay in the same color range but only change the color brightness. Now you'll notice here that the background of our video player is a large white canvas. If we were to place this application on a web page that has a non-white background, this canvas would be visible. It wouldn't be very pleasing to the eye. So first, let's move our video player by selecting the video window and then moving that near the upper left-hand corner of our main canvas. And the amount of space that we're leaving is going to represent our margin between other items on the web page. Of course, there are other ways to program that directly from the web page itself. So if you wanted to, you could move it all the way up to the upper left-hand corner. And now let's resize that main canvas by selecting the user control and then resizing that. Now you'll notice that the actual white background doesn't change in size. That's because our layout root does not have the width and height set to auto. You can change it to auto by clicking these buttons here next to width and height. And now we can finally make that background transparent by choosing the background under brushes and then choosing no brush. Now let's zoom in at 100%. Now the last thing we want to do is increase the size of our logo. So let's go over to the Objects and Timeline panel and select the logo badge. Now it's not possible to resize this logo by dragging the container handles, as you can see here. The best way to resize vector artwork like this is to go into the Properties panel, scroll down to the Transform subpanel, and then open up the Scale subpanel, and then increasing the X and the Y component of the scale factor. So let's increase that by 20% by typing in 1.2 for X and 1.2 for Y. Now we could do the same thing for our buttons, but the buttons are made from raster images and they won't scale very well. So you can see here that the resolution isn't very good. But sometimes a little bit of scaling actually isn't too bad. So I'm going to leave it back at 1. So now our video player is really starting to look beautiful. In this tutorial, we've covered fills, gradients, strokes, and beveled edges, and also scaling of individual components. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next time.